Alright everyone, buckle up! For this video I took out my old laptop and dug out my bachelor thesis. This is for the literary theory nerds out there. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Visual Storytelling with Olschi. I'm Olschi and here we talk about storytelling, comics and art in general. I wasn't sure whether I should make this video. Many people will probably find it boring or maybe not even click on it at all. But I was too busy to change my monthly schedule and find another topic, so here we go. Grab a pillow and a blanket. We're gonna talk some theory. We probably all have learned about the different types of narrator in literary text in school. There is a first-person narrator who uses I and is part of the story. A lot of YA literature uses it. The most famous example would be Twilight. Then there is the second-person narrator who uses you. It's not used very often because the fictional reader is part of the story. At the subway station you wait 15 minutes on the platform for a train. Finally, a local, narrated by graffiti, shuffles into the station. You get a seat and hoist a copy of the New York Post. The Post is the most shameful of your several addictions. Jane and Ernie, bright lights, big city. And the last one is the third-person narrator, which is probably most common. It uses he, she and them to describe what the characters are doing. And the third-person narrator is usually not part of the story. Usually. And then all of those narrators can be omnipresent, where they basically are a god in the world and know everything that goes on, what everyone is thinking, what everyone is feeling. Or they can be unreliable. The narrator may give you untrue or misleading information. And then there is the fly-on-wall narrator, where the narrator is objective like a camera. Basically, they don't express any judgment, they cannot say what someone is feeling if they're not showing it. When you have a text, the narrator is usually easily recognizable. When Bella Swan in Twilight says, "I looked away, hiding my eyes as I thrilled to the world," we know she's the narrator. She tells the story. Same with the following example. Harry, Ron and Hermione were joined at the tray by a curly-haired Hufflepuff boy. Harry knew by sight, but had never spoken to. Here we have a third-person narrator who is also kind of omnipresent, as they know what Harry is thinking or feeling. But can there be a narrator if there is no narrative text, like in comics? There is no she thought or he jumped up and down. In comics you use pictures to tell the story, and narrative text is usually very limited. It might tell the setting of your story in the very beginning, or give some information on time and space. Sometimes you can also have the first-person narrator, which is pretty common in shoujo manga. The narrative text itself is usually marked by different speech bubbles. It can be a square frame, or there can be no frame at all. Basically, the text just floats in the room. This way the reader can see that this text is not dialogue. But most of the time in comics, you don't really have anyone who describes what is happening. The pictures are describing it. Does it mean there is no narrator? Not exactly. As Sandra Boscherhoff states in Tall Tales in Comic Diction, from literature to graphic fiction, an internal analysis of comic adaptation in literary texts. Wow, that's a mouthful. A picture does not necessarily provide a narrator as a textual narrative does. Therefore, it seems to have no narrator at all. Yet this is not true. If a picture shows a narrative content, somebody has to choose what is seen. And this is necessarily done by some kind of narrative agent. Hence, a comic narrator is at the same time the one who shows in pictures and the one who tells in captions. However, the ever-present showing of the narrative content is the foremost means of storytelling. Basically, in comics and manga, narrator is the one who chooses what is seen in what panel and how it is shown. Panel sequence is the narrative. Instead of saying he shouted, the speech bubble will be bigger and spiky. So even though no text describes that someone is shouting, the reader sees the facial expression, the speech bubble, and connects the dots. The job of the narrator is to lead the reader, to give clues as to what is happening, since you cannot simply describe what is happening with a lot of text. The narrator can be part of the story, so they can be a character, or they can be outside of the story and basically overviewing everything that is happening. There are usually no space or time limits to a narrator who is not a character in the story. Basically, you can make jumps in time, or you can go to a wholly different place within the story, completely independent of the characters. And just to make it clear, the narrator is not the same as the author. The author is you. Your job is to create the kind of persona who tells the story. Someone who chooses what is shown and in what way it is shown. You would tell a comedy story differently than you would a horror story, and for that you create a set of rules for how to tell the story, which becomes the narrator. In literary text, it's also called the voice, basically how the story is told, how the prose is, how descriptive it is, etc. And I guess the voice is probably the same as the narrator. So creating this persona who tells the story, who might not be part of the story, is kind of the voice who tells the story. Do you understand what I mean? Are you bored yet? Literary theory is confusing. And to make things even more confusing, next to the narrator you also have the vocalization. Vocalization focuses on a character within the story, and we get to see and experience the story through their eyes. We get a glimpse into their thoughts and emotions. So this vocalization can be on just one character, or various characters, or no characters at all, in which case it will be an external vocalization. You can find the external vocalization in manga like Monster, because here you have a thriller story. The narrator keeps the tension by not showing you what certain characters are thinking. This way you don't know what to expect from the scene. As a contrast, in shonen manga you can use vocalization as a clever way of telling the story. For example, you have a fight scene. It's a tournament arc and you have a fight scene and you have an audience. And then you have selected characters in the audience whose thoughts we as the reader get a glimpse into. And they describe what is happening. Oh, he used this blah blah move. It should be impossible, blah blah blah. The narrator focuses on the thoughts of this character to use these thoughts as a commentary or narration. In manga in general, it is quite common to switch vocalization from one character to another and then to external again. You rarely find a story where the vocalization is kept the same way throughout the whole story. But it's important to choose whose thoughts and emotions you are going to show. Is it going to be only the protagonist, or is it going to be also other characters, or no characters at all? Sometimes when you read the story and you mostly read the thoughts of the protagonist, and then suddenly there's another character and you get to know what they are thinking. And it can be pretty disruptive because you ask yourself, why do I suddenly know what this person is thinking? In the end, it all depends on what kind of effect you're going for. There are many ways of using this knowledge to your advantage. Thinking about who tells the story, how they tell it, and what characters' thoughts and emotions do we get to see. Also, maybe integrating an unreliable narrator who tells the story from a very subjective point of view can be interesting. One of the most unusual but interesting instances of playing around with the narrator and the vocalization I have read so far is in Katsuhiro Otomo's Visitors. Visitors is a short story where you basically in the body of the protagonist, I guess, who visits a friend, and then through dialogue and conflict they discover that this friend has a couple of dead bodies in their flat. It's a bit of a dark story, not unusual for Katsuhiro Otomo's, but what is most interesting is that here we get to experience the story literally through the eyes of this first-person point of view, but without knowing what they're actually thinking. Because at no point do you get to read what you are thinking. It's a truly bizarre experience. It's like a game where you play like a first-person shooter, but here you have no agency. You have no control over what this character is doing or saying. You don't even get to hear what you yourself are saying. You only get to see the reaction of the character in front of you and how they reply to what you are apparently saying. As a reader, we are stuck in the body of this person whom we don't know, we haven't seen the face of. It's kind of terrifying. At the end of the story, we still don't know anything about this person. Its closing shot is that of of a cow and bull humping on the field, while the dude we just left the apartment of is asking whether we will leave them alone or not. I'm not sure how to interpret that one yet. I think this story might actually be an example of the rare second-person narrator. First, I didn't think that this can exist in manga, but actually here it does. Someone else is describing what you are doing. It's truly fascinating, but I would feel really uncomfortable reading a whole series told in that way. Same probably goes for a book, but I haven't read a book in second-person narrator yet. So, just to sum up, the narrator in comics does exist, even if there is no narrative text. They can be a character of the story or be completely outside of the story. They are the ones who choose what is shown in the panels. And focalization is showing the thoughts and feelings of certain characters. It can be internal, focusing on this or that character, or it can be external, focusing on no characters at all, so basically you don't get a glimpse into thoughts and feelings of any characters. So is any of this information actually important? I don't know. You can probably develop a pretty good intuition for what to do by simply reading enough manga and comics. But knowing this, you might think about in what scene it's best to show whose emotion, in what scene you can show certain characters' thoughts, or what you want to show in what scene, and whether it makes sense to make a jump within space or time. As for my manga, Another Me, I use a third-person narrator, and I focus mostly on the protagonist Ilso. This way the reader can experience the story through her eyes. At the same time, by choosing a third-person narrator, I am not constricted to Ilso only. I can basically go to a different time or space within the story and show what is going on there. But then I usually choose not to show what all these characters are thinking. I only show the thoughts of Ilso ever. Of course, I could have chosen a first-person narrator. I could only show what is happening around her and never go to different times and places. But for the kind of story I want to tell, the third-person narrator just works better. And by the way, I did not think of all this stuff when I was writing the story. I only categorized it when I was writing the script for this episode, which again proves that you don't need to know this stuff. It's a good tool to know, it's literary theory, but just because you don't know it doesn't mean that you write bad stories. So how do you approach your manga? Do you think about whose point of view your story is told? While in written text there is no way around asking yourself these questions. Who tells the story? In a medium like comics, it's usually much more fluid and flexible. So I wonder whether there are other literary theory nerds out there who thought about these things in comics and manga. Because if you did never think about it, I seriously don't blame you. This stuff can be quite confusing and boring. I can imagine my professor falling asleep at uni when he was reading my thesis. 12 points for Hufflepuff. I wish I went to Hogwarts. Anyways, next month it will be less theoretical, I promise. Until then, you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. And you can also read my manga, Another Me, for free. Or you can order print copies if you like. Thank you for watching this episode and I hope to see you in the next one. Please like and subscribe. Bye!